Hi, this is Adam Murray, and for this presentation I'm going to be talking about the effects of religiosity on the experience of death and dying, and I'm going to be talking about that specifically from a psychodynamic developmental perspective. The main points in this presentation that I'll be covering are the developmental theories of three of the main psychodynamic theorists. I'll be covering demographic information on religion, including world population, distribution by country, and life expectancy. I'll be going over 5 different research articles that will give us some information on secular and non-secular experience of death and dying. And finally, I'll be integrating this information into a cohesive whole by reviewing and discussing it from a developmental context. So in order to create a more holistic presentation, I'll just briefly be covering the developmental theories of Freud, Jung, and Erikson. Sigmund Freud was the father of psychoanalysis and the pioneer for psychodynamic theory. He was born in the mid-19th century and proposed that lifespan development happened in 5 psychosexual stages. Carl Jung was born in the 3rd quarter of the 19th century and viewed life as a continual process, though he also talked about it in the first and second halves of life as well as the midlife. Erik Erikson was born at the beginning of the 20th century and proposed that lifespan development actually happened in 8 psychosocial stages. First, I'll go over Freud's 5 psychosexual stages. He separated out his stages by age and also the erogenous zones, or the zones in which somebody at that particular stage derives the most pleasure from. The first stage that he had described was the oral stage, which starts at birth and lasts until you're 1 year old. The erogenous zones of this stage are the lips, tongue, and gums, and someone in this stage derives pleasure from sucking and feeding. Freud's second psychosexual stage was the anal stage, which started at year 1 and lasted until year 3. The erogenous zone of this stage is the anus, and an example of something that somebody in this stage might derive pleasure from is toilet training. The third stage is the phallic stage, which starts at 3 and goes until year 6. The erogenous zone is the phallus, and pleasure is derived from genital stimulation. The latent stage, which is the 4th stage, starting at 6 and ending at the 11th year, is less of a stage and more of an interlude between the phallic stage and the genital stage. It's a period when the sexual needs of an individual is quiet. The 5th stage is the genital stage, which goes from year 11 through adulthood. The erogenous zone of this stage is the genitals, and the genitals are really the focus of the pleasurable sensations from this point on. Now, for Jung's model of lifelong development, he thought about it in terms of the first half of life and the second half of life, with the midlife being the transitional period between the first and second. He thought that the first half of life was about passion, about finding happiness, and about accomplishment, and being more outwardly oriented. And for the midlife, he thought that that was about reason or finding meaning in life. For the second half, he thought that that was about wisdom and well-being, more inwardly oriented and finding fulfillment. For Erikson's 8 psychosocial stages, he separated them all into dichotomies. So for the first one, which it goes from birth to the 1st year, he said that that was about establishing trust versus mistrust. He said that babies would either trust that others will care for their basic needs, or they would develop mistrust about the care of others. The second stage was about autonomy versus shame and doubt, and that went from the 1st year to the 3rd year. About that, he said, children either become self-sufficient in many activities or doubt their own abilities. For the 3rd stage, he defined that by initiative versus guilt, and that went from 3 years old to 6 years old. It said about that stage that children either want to undertake many adult-like activities, or they internalize the limits and prohibitions set by their parents. The 4th stage is about industry versus inferiority, and that goes from 6 years old to about 12 years old. In this stage, children busily learn to be competent and productive, or they feel inferior, unable to do anything as well as they wish they could. The fifth stage is about identity versus confusion, and that goes from ages 12 to 19. In this stage, adolescents are trying to figure out who they are. They're establishing sexual, political, and vocational identities, or they're confused about what roles they should be playing. The sixth stage is intimacy versus isolation, going from age 19 to 40 years old. In this stage, young adults are seeking companionship and love, or they become isolated from others, fearing rejection and disappointment. The seventh stage is generativity versus stagnation, and that goes from ages 40 to 65. And in this stage, middle-aged adults contribute to the next generation through meaningful work, creative activities, and raising a family, or they stagnate. The eighth and final stage is about integrity versus despair, and that goes from age 65 to death. In this stage, older adults try to make sense out of their lives, either seeing life as a meaningful whole or despairing at goals never reached. The next part of this presentation, I'll be talking about the demographics of religion, and the Pew Research Center was a great resource to find information here. And as you can see by this chart here, it shows the number of people who were affiliated with each religion, or at least the most popular ones. And the numbers here are shown in billions. The first and the most popular religion in the world is Christianity, and up next is Islam, and then the third one is actually unaffiliated, so atheist, agnostic, non-religious, secular people. The next is Hinduism, the following Buddhism, and then you have your folk religions, and that's, like Shinto might be considered a folk religion, or Taoism. And then you've got other religions, and then what surprised me was actually that Judaism only made up 0.01 billion people. The next slide here is showing countries based on their religious majority. And as you can see, Christianity is just widespread in Europe and in Russia, as well as North and South America. And interestingly enough, in the southern half of Africa. Otherwise, Islam is really popular in Northern Africa and in the Middle East. Hinduism being very popular in India. Buddhism being mostly in South Asia. And then it's hard really to see, but there are a few clumps of blue kind of in Europe and Northern Europe. Next is life expectancy at birth, and these are projected life expectancies from 2010 to 2055, and the figures in the graph are shown in years. And as stated in the Pew Research Center article, this is based on country-level data. So it's important to consider what the country's majority living situation is like. Are they first world countries? Do they have modern medicine and that sort of thing? And what is their lifestyle like? And how does that differ from other countries who might have a different religious majority? So as you can see here, and what I think is quite interesting is that the Jews are living the longest between 80 and 85 years old, while being the religious minority in the world currently. And as you can see, it's not necessarily following what the population majorities are. And it's interesting that Christians are living between 71 and 76, which is on the lower end of this graph. So after briefly covering some demographic information, I'll now be covering a handful of research articles. The first study is looking at the effects of religious hope on death anxiety. And this one's cool because it looks at the difference between religious hope and general hope, and it compares it to different age ranges, so it's particularly relevant for the developmental perspective. And the findings of this research showed that death anxiety is the highest in under 30 years old, but death anxiety stays fairly high up until age 39 when it starts to drop. And then it drops pretty steadily from there, but in 80 plus it goes slightly up compared to 70 to 79 age range. And so their finding as far as religious hope goes showed that having more religious hope had a significant decrease in death anxiety as they progressed through the age ranges. However, in younger people, it didn't have much of an effect. And by younger people, I mean under the age of 30. They also compared religious hope versus general hope, and they found that religious hope had a significant impact while general hope did not. In this study, the researchers were looking at the effects of religious doubt on death anxiety and depressive symptoms in adults over the age of 65, and they also observed the differences in people who identified as white and those who identified as black. All of the participants in this survey identified as Christian. So what they'd found was that the degree of religious doubt that they were experiencing had a positive correlation with their experiences of depressive symptoms. And the effect of religious doubt on depressive symptoms was greater in those who identified as black versus those who identified as white. This next piece of research is looking at the effects of religiosity in both Christians and Muslims in the United States and Saudi Arabia, respectively. The findings in this study was that while the degree of religiosity didn't really have an effect on the levels of death distress that they were experiencing, religious adherence did have an effect on their overall quality of life. For this piece of research, the researchers are looking at the differences in death anxiety in participants that are living in Ekiti State, Nigeria, and they're separating it out into 3 different age cohorts: early adulthood, middle, and late adulthood. And they're also observing the differences between Christian and Muslim participants, which are the 2 main religious factions in Ekiti, Nigeria. What they found was kind of interesting. While the individuals in early adulthood in both Christian and Muslim communities didn't show any significant difference in death anxiety, as they start to move further into life, as in middle adulthood and late adulthood, the Christian population actually becomes more death anxious than the Muslim population, which is contrary to what the last study had shown. This next study is a case study on a Buddhist individual, and the intention of this study is that by observing the beliefs of this individual as they relate to Buddhism, we might get some insight on how other Buddhists, or Buddhism as a whole, might affect the experience of life, death, and death anxiety. One of the differences of this study compared to the other few that I've covered already is that this religion doesn't necessarily believe in an afterlife. Instead, they have the concept of reincarnation, and with that, they've also got a practice around letting go of worldly attachments. One of those worldly attachments being life itself, and that's demonstrated by one of their first core tenets, that life is suffering. And in order to live a good life, you have to be able to, in a way, let go of it and come to a certain level of acceptance with death itself. This last piece of research that I'll be covering is actually from a pharmacological standpoint and is more secular, but does reach into the spiritual and mystical in its findings. The research is to do with giving psilocybin, which is a psychedelic drug, to people with cancer, and observing its effects on their experience of death anxiety. After one moderate dose of psilocybin, participants experienced quite significant decreases in depression, fairly significant anxiolytic effects, and an increase in quality of life. One interesting note here from this piece of research is that they'd stated that 70% of the participants rated psilocybin experience as the singular or top 5 most spiritually significant, or the singular or top 5 most personally meaningful experiences of their entire lives. 87% reported increased life satisfaction or well-being attributed to the experience. With that being the last piece of research that I'll be covering in this presentation, I'd like to move on to integration and summation of this information within the developmental context and talk a little bit about the implications of religious affiliation on the experience of death, dying, and death anxiety. I'd like to start off by reading some quotations by the psychodynamic theorists, as well as by some of the important figures in various religions. The first one I'd like to read is from Sigmund Freud, and he said, "If we are to take it as a truth that knows no exception, that everything dies for internal reasons, becomes inorganic once again, then we shall be compelled to say that the aim of all life is death, and, looking backwards, that inanimate things existed before living ones." The next one is from Carl Jung, and he said, Death is an important interest, especially to an aging person. A categorical question is being put to him, and he is under an obligation to answer it. To this end, he ought to have a myth about death, for reason shows him nothing but the dark pit into which he is descending. The last from the psychodynamic theorists is Erik Erikson, and this one's a short one. He said, "Healthy children will not fear life if their elders have enough integrity not to fear death." What I take from these quotes by the psychodynamic theorists is that it's, one, important to accept the reality that we're all going to die someday, and that it's important to cultivate a sense of peace around death. As Jung said, it's important that we have a myth around death. And then, as Erikson pointed out, in order to foster a lack of fear of life in the generation before us, it's important to cultivate a lack of fear of death in our generation. Now I'll read a few quotations from religious figures from history. The first one I'd like to quote is St. Paul, who was an apostle of Christ and was the author of the book of Romans in the Holy Bible. He wrote there that we were buried therefore with him by baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. The next is from Rumi, who was a Sufi poet, and Sufism is considered Islamic mysticism. Rumi wrote, "I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to an animal. I died as an animal and I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying?" And the last religious figure I'd like to quote is Bodhidharma, who is considered the father or founder of Zen Buddhism. And what he said was, "One clings to life although there is nothing to be called life. Another clings to death although there is nothing to be called death. In reality, there is nothing to be born. Consequently, there is nothing to perish." As these quotes by the religious figures demonstrate, and to contrast it from how the psychodynamic theorists talk about it, they are actually giving more practical information as to why or perhaps how we can have less fear around death. And it seems like there's an emphasis on acceptance, or even in some regards, rejection or denial of the reality of death, or even a transcendence of such. So with all of this information, I think that we start to get a little bit of a clear picture on the experiences of death and dying, both throughout the lifespan as well as how religion and religiosity affects that. As far as religion's effect on our experience of death and dying, I think that as we've seen by the research presented here, it really depends. Some of the research has shown that one religion over another is more or less anxious, but it also shows that age is an important factor, and that religion's effect on death anxiety changes over time. I think that Jung and Erikson's models of lifespan development are more relevant in considering how an individual experiences death and death anxiety in regards to their religious affiliations. A way that we might be able to wrap this information presented by the research in a developmental context is to look at, for instance, the research showing that as someone progresses through the lifespan, death anxiety decreases. From Erikson's perspective, we might look at, for instance, in ages 12 to 19, how are individuals developing as far as their religious identity, and what kind of beliefs they're developing around life, death, and the afterlife. Or we might look at the integrity versus despair stage and ask if the individuals felt like they've had a meaningful and fulfilling life, or if they are feeling that they really haven't done as much or of what they would have liked to have done in their life. An area that I would think would be an important place for further research is there an opportunity for those who are not particularly religious or interested in theistic religion in the first place, so that they might still also reap the benefits of decreased death anxiety later in life? So in this presentation, I've covered briefly some of the psychodynamic theory. I talked a little bit about the demographics of religion. I went over 5 pieces of research, and I reviewed that information and talked a little bit about what it might mean and areas of further research that might be interesting to pursue.